everyone, welcome back to Chapter 3. So in the last two chapters, we did an overview of administration. Chapter 2, we spent a lot of time talking about organizations and management and leadership and communication. So this week, we're going to move on to Chapter 3, which is the last chapter in the unit on the intro material. We're going to talk about criminal justice and the employment rights. So there's a lot of laws that I'm going to throw at you. So I highly recommend you print out the reference sheet that I created. It will be very useful on your homework and on the exam you're going to have to take. No lawyer can memorize everything. So you use references. And one of the things I provided is the references of all of these employment laws. And it will be very useful as a reference. You can't be expected to memorize everything. But what we're going to do is go through what some of these laws are. And what we're trying to achieve is the idea of what we call issue recognition. Now, remember, you're going to be an administrator in the criminal justice field at some point, probably in your career. And you want to know, when is there something that I have to be concerned about? When is there an issue that I have to recognize? You may not personally be able to answer the legal question, but you'll recognize that there's something that's there, and you'll know then to call your legal counsel and get advice on that issue. So that's really the purpose of this week, is just kind of familiarizing you with the different employment laws that actually exist out there, okay? So I'm going to share my PowerPoint, and we're going to talk about employee rights, okay? So we're going to talk about rights of a criminal justice employee. So these are different legal issues that an administrator has to be aware of because their employees may have these rights. So just to get you started and thinking about it, can you think of any rights that you have as an employee in New York State? Okay, so if any of you are employed and you work somewhere, what rights do you have as an employee? So we are going to then talk about what those rights are. Now, one important distinction I want to make is, are you a public employee? Or are you a private employee? So we talked about that in the first week. Do you work for the private sector, which is a private company? If you work for a private sector in New York, you are what's called an employee at will, which means your boss can hire and fire you at any time they want, as long as it's not for discriminatory purposes. If you work for a public employer, there may be different things. So if you work for the government, there may be additional protections that you have that you wouldn't have necessarily if you were working for a private employee. So we'll be talking about that as we work through, okay? So why do we have to know the laws concerning employee rights? I kind of already mentioned this. I'm not expecting anybody to become a legal expert. What I'm hoping is that you're just aware that some of these issues exist. So if you're in the field working and you're like, oh wait, I remember mentioning something, and then you know to pick up the phone and call legal counsel, and then they can help you navigate through the issue before it gets worse or something else can go wrong. Okay, so when we're talking about employee rights and laws, you're basically talking about what we call the employment relationship. So the relationship between the employees and the employers, okay, and the administration. When you're thinking about that relationship, there's different issues that can arise. There can be issues with recruitment and hiring. So you could violate somebody's rights in recruiting certain people or hiring certain people, or your hiring practices, how you go about hiring people. There could be employment relationship issues dealing with assignments, who gets what job within the profession. Are you suspending an employee? Are you terminating an employee? Are you violating any of their rights in those practices? Employees may have certain property interests or property rights in their job that you just can't take away, especially if you're a public employer. You're not an employee at will. And then you may have certain issues with pay or benefits or things like that. So we're going to kind of walk through some of these things and some of the laws that would govern some of these practices. Okay, so we're going to start with the idea of recruitment and hiring. What are some of the laws that would affect recruitment and hiring? So to get you thinking about that, I just have a scenario. You are the warden at an all-women correctional facility. You're in the process of hiring a new correctional officer. You have narrowed down your options down to 2 individuals. One candidate is a male, the other is a female. You tell the hiring committee to hire the female because you have mostly men and you want and need more females. So the question is, can you do that? Can you prefer to have one gender over another gender? Okay. Now, one of the laws that would govern that decision is Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. What Title VII says, it prohibits unlawful employment discrimination in hiring, discharge, which is firing, work conditions, and unlawful provisions of benefits, so giving certain people benefits over others, based on criteria, what we call protected criteria, protected class criteria, race, color, religion, sex, national origin. So what it is saying is, in general, the rule is you should not make employment decisions for hiring, firing, work conditions, or benefits based on any of these characteristics, okay? And this is this can extend to what we call a hostile work environment. That means if you are giving provisions, work conditions, things like that, to certain groups over others, you can be creating a hostile work environment, which would violate those employees' rights, okay? Now, just like any law, it's not an absolute law, okay? And we'll talk about that in a minute. Now, when we think of this rule in hiring and recruitment procedures, let's think about it. You are an administrator. Can you have certain legal requirements? Do the job requirements accurately reflect what is needed for the job? So if you have certain characteristics that are required for a job, you have to ask yourselves, are those characteristics actually needed for the job? So if you have a characteristic in there that the person has to have blonde hair, is there something about the job that makes people with blonde hair do it better? Is it actually a requirement for the job? And do the test validly test the skills needed for that job? So when you are talking about hiring tests, which is a huge thing in criminal justice, civil service tests, when they are testing you during a civil service test, are they actually testing you on skills that you need in your job, right? They can't just randomly test, like you're a auto mechanic and they're testing you on if you know advanced calculus. Is that really needed for your job as an auto mechanic or as a criminal justice teacher? And if you're testing on things that aren't necessary for the job, that could violate Title VII, okay? So you have to look at your job descriptions and make sure that they're only including things that are needed for the job. And if you're testing civil service tests, things like that, before you're giving people the job, you have to assure that your test is actually testing for the things that are necessary for that job, okay? Now, there's another concept that we call disparate impact. So sometimes you could have job requirements or tests that are blatantly racist or blatantly sexist or something like that, right? I only am going to hire women, or I'm only going to hire men. Those are blatant discrimination, unless you have a valid reason in the job or you need that characteristic, okay? But sometimes you put in requirements that affect one group over another sort of peripherally. Maybe your intent, direct intent, wasn't to discriminate against certain people, but the requirement you put forth has an ultimate discriminatory effect on a certain group of people. So you can't have that either. You can't have what we call disparate impact. So you can't deliberately discriminate against them, but you can't have requirements that even ultimately lead to discrimination against that person, that protected group. Now, there is one exception to this. This is what we call a bona fide occupational qualifier. there are circumstances that maybe there is a characteristic that is necessary. If you can convince the court that that characteristic is necessary for the job to be properly carried out, then they may allow you to discriminate against a type of person because of that characteristic. But you're going to have to convince the court that that characteristic that you're requiring, even though it is discriminatory against a group, a protected group, it is a necessary qualification to work in that job. Okay, so we'll look at some examples to make it more clear. So you are the chief of police department. You're in the process of hiring a new officer. You narrowed your individuals down to two. If one candidate is a male, the other is a female. You tell the hiring committee to hire the male because you think being a male is a bona fide occupational qualifier. So my question to you is, and if you go back to the previous one that we talked about, what about this? You want to hire a woman. Is it a bona fide occupational qualification to have to be a female to work in a female prison? And then the second one is it a bona fide occupational qualifier to be a male, to be a police officer? Are there legitimate, non-discriminatory reasons why you need certain genders in certain careers? And in both of those, I would argue no, right? You don't have to be a female to work in a female prison. You can have males do the job. You don't have to be a male to be a police officer. There may be some beliefs out there that you do, but that is just not true. You cannot point to legitimate, reliable, credible reasons why you have to be a male in order to be a police officer, okay? So when you think about certain hiring requirements, physical requirements like height or weight or something like that, intellectual requirements, so the testing requirements, psychological requirements, drug testing requirements, these would all be things you would want to put on, like we're only going to hire people that fit certain characteristics. If you do that, you have to make sure those requirements that you're placing on the potential employees are not having a direct discriminatory effect on somebody. So if you just say males, that's direct. Or if you say you have to be blonde, that would be a physical requirement. You have to have a bona fide occupational qualification for that. You have to have a reason why only blondes would work in that position, okay? If you don't have that, then your hiring requirements could be violating Title VII. So when you're creating your descriptions of who you want to hire, be very careful that you're not including things that could be discriminatory directly towards a protected group or even have that disparate impact on that group. So let's think about some examples. You are the chief of police department. You are in the process of hiring a new officer. You want to require that all hires be at least 5'10", okay? So the qualification is height. Is that outward discrimination? Are tall or short people protected classes? And the answer is no. Remember, race, gender, ethnicity, national origin, sexual orientation, those are protected groups. So height is not a protected group. So there's no outward discrimination, right? But does it cause a disparate impact on a protected group? So my question would be, how many women do you know are over 5'10"? I'm pretty tall and I'm only 5'8", 5'7", 5'8", right? So is it having a disparate impact on women, right? Or are there different nationalities or ethnicities that tend to be a little shorter? Does it have a disparate impact then on those groups? And is height a bona fide occupational qualification? Do you have to be really tall to be a police officer? So if not, then you could be having a discriminatory employee hiring requirement. So you really have to think through those types of requirements. Now, you're a chief of police department. You have an application for a new patrol who is a military veteran. During one of their deployments, they lost their leg in an attack. They currently walk with a prosthetic leg. You do not want to hire them because of the disability. Now, disability is not protected under Title VII. Remember, it only protects race, nationality, race, national origin, gender. All of a sudden I'm drawing a blank on them. You know, those protected groups. Disability is not one of them. Okay, so can you then discriminate against somebody for their disability under Title VII? Now, we may talk about another one that is in the future, but under Title VII, can you discriminate against them? You probably can under Title VII because it's not a protected group, but you can't because we also have another law that's called the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. This act removes barriers from hiring, discrimination, and things like that for people that are otherwise qualified but have a disability. Okay, now it is going to go back to that bona fide occupational qualification. Does your career, does the job that you're offering require somebody not to have a disability, right? So the question then becomes, can you be a police officer with only one leg? If the answer is no, then you can refuse to hire them even though they have a disability. But can you be a file clerk in a police department without a leg? Sure, probably. So you can't refuse to hire them in that situation because it's not a bona fide occupational qualification. And you must make reasonable accommodations to employees when they have these disabilities. So if you suffer from a disability and you can still do your job with that disability and still carry out the functions of the job, they can't discriminate against you, and they have to make accommodations. So let's say you only have one leg and you want to check out groceries at the grocery store, and they have a requirement that all clerks have to stand the entire shift. And you really can't do that because of your one leg. It's too much pressure on your one leg, and it causes you severe pain at the end of the night. So you just want a stool. Can you still carry out the functions of your job if you're sitting on a stool? The answer is yes. If that's the case, they can't discriminate against you in hiring, and they have to provide you with those reasonable accommodations to carry out the job. That would not be a reason not to hire you in that job. So when you think about this, you have to think about the job, you have to think about what's necessary for the job, and you have to decide, so what's necessary for the job, is it a bona fide occupational qualification? And then can this person still do the job if you give them some sort of accommodation? So when you think about it, can a blind or deaf person be a police officer? Is seeing and hearing a necessity, a bona fide occupational qualification for a police officer? I would say you have a pretty strong argument that it is. Can you have a blind attorney? I'm not sure. It depends what kind of law you're practicing. If you have to go to court and show exhibits and read people's faces, maybe it is a bona fide occupational qualification to be able to see. But if you're a transactional lawyer, you're sitting in an office and you're just working on paperwork and documents and things like that, and you have a reader and you have other accommodations, maybe not. Maybe you can be blind. Can you have a police officer in a wheelchair? Maybe not, because you have to run, you have to catch people, getting in and out of the car quickly. Maybe being able to walk is a bona fide occupational qualification for a police officer. Could you have an attorney in a wheelchair? Probably. You don't have those same considerations. So those are the types of things that you have to think about when you're thinking about disabilities and bona fide occupational qualifications. Now, When we talk about hiring, often this issue of what we call affirmative action comes up. Affirmative action is the idea that an organization may have a policy where they're going to prefer certain groups over other groups to make up for past discrimination. Okay, so maybe your company has never had the proper amount of racial equality. So then you start passing rules that say, we are going to prefer hiring Black people over others to make up for that discrimination. Can you do that? So you see this a lot when you're talking about education. Certain colleges in the past have not had proper or a national origin, race, ethnicity balances. So they've tried to balance that out by preferring certain groups over others. It's very, very controversial. Some people are for it. They think it's a great way to start equalizing the workplace. Some people are very against it because it's just another form of discrimination. So this is a highly contested issue in criminal justice a lot of times too. When you're talking about civil service tests and preference for certain groups, maybe you want a more racial diversity on your police department to represent the racial diversity in your community. And you have two perfectly equal qualified people. Is it okay to choose the minority over a white person so you can reach that balance? So, it's a very controversial issue. I really can see both sides in this issue a lot of times. So it's difficult, but just be aware that this is constantly out there and it's always circulating, and there's always different court cases out there talking about this concept. Okay, so that was recruitment and hiring. Now we need to move on to assignment of jobs, like who gets what duties, suspension, and firing. Okay, so we'll think about that. You're the chief of police. You have a female officer that just informed you that she is pregnant. She says she can still work a normal shift, but you don't want her to get hurt, so you make her sit at the desk until she delivers the baby. Can you do that? Well, there is a law called the Pregnancy Discrimination Act of 1978. And what this says is you cannot treat women that are pregnant different from other people, okay? So as long as she can still do the job. Now, when she's 9 months pregnant, maybe she can't run people down. Maybe that's a different situation. It would be a bona fide occupational qualification. But when she's just started out, at the beginning, she's pregnant, she can still do the job. You can't discriminate against her. And any side effects or, nausea, morning sickness, things like that affect her job, you have to treat like a short-term disability. So you can't just fire her because she's pregnant and has this morning sickness. Morning sickness lasts until you have the child. So you could find alternatives because of that in other forms of work. But since it's a temporary disability, you can't just fire them. You have to treat them like somebody else. What if one of your officers breaks their leg? You're not going to just fire them. So you have to treat them like another officer and provide them with accommodations until that pregnancy is over. Okay. Now, should there be a mandatory retirement age for police officers or correctional officers? What about judges and attorneys? Do we think age should play a factor in these positions? Well, there's a law called the Age Discrimination Act, which prohibits unequal treatment of applicants or employees based on their age. Okay. And in the federal system, we're talking over 40. So hiring, firing, benefits, jobs, can you discriminate against people based on age? Now, again, is age a bona fide occupational qualification? You have to be young to do this job. You have to think about that. Otherwise, you cannot discriminate against people because of their age. So instead of making it an age requirement, because a lot of police departments would say, well, we just say you have to retire at 40 because we think age is a bona fide occupied qualification. You got to be young. Well, do you really have to be young? or what you really mean is you still have to be fit and to be able to carry out the functions of the job. So is there another way other than just putting an age limit on it that could test that, right? Because I know some people that are 60s, 50s, 60s that are way more fit than people that I know that are in 20s and 30s. So instead of testing just age, can you test something else? Maybe they have to be able to run. Maybe they have to do a run in a certain amount of time. So you could test that in another way instead of just putting an age restriction on it. So you are the chief of police, you have a female officer, has a sick child. The worker will have to miss 2 weeks of work to care for the child. You want to fire her for missing work because you don't want to pay others for overtime. Can you do that? Well, we have in our country what's called the Family Medical Leave Act. The Family Medical Leave Act provides for unpaid leave for certain things. So you have a child that's born or you adopt a new child, they have to give you some leave without firing you for that. They don't have to pay you, but they have to give you some leave. Care for an immediate family member with a serious health condition, medical leave for employees that you can't work because you have a temporary illness. So you have the right to take care of your family for a short amount of time. In the federal system, it's unpaid. In New York, we provide for some paid leave, but that's a New York state rule, okay? So if you have people that need a little bit of time off to take care of their family, you have to provide that. And so you would have to think about that. Now, one of the things you also may have is you may have a property right in your job. That means you have a right to keep your job, okay? So if you are going to fire an employee and you are a public employer, so you work for the government, that public employee may have a property interest in their job. Now, we said if you work for a private employee, we are an at-will employee at-will state. So they can hire and fire you as long as it's not based on one of those discrimination factors we just talked about. But if you work for the government, by working for the government, you may have a property interest in your job. So prior to just firing you, they may have to provide you with certain protections. Now, what would those protections be? They may have to give you some sort of a hearing. They may have to tell you why you're being fired and provide evidence for being fired. You have to have a valid, justifiable reason for it, not just because they don't like you. Once you have a hearing, they have to tell you what it says, and you have to have a right to respond to it, okay? So you have to be given these basic due process rights if you're a public employee before you are fired. Now, pay and benefits. What are some of your rights for pay and benefits? You are chief of police. Many are upset about changes occurring in society. Numerous protests occur every day, different issues. All your officers have already worked 40 hours per week to maintain order, and it's only Thursday. You don't want to pay overtime because it will affect your yearly budget. So you say, instead of paying overtime for every day you work, I'll give you an extra vacation day later. Can you do that? Well, pay issues and those kinds of things are controlled by the Fair Labor Standards Act, okay? What the Fair Labor Standards Act says is that if you are in a salaried position, you have a minimum salary, they must provide for overtime. So we can't just give you a salary and then say, you're salaried, you don't get overtime. Like, okay, so there's difference between getting paid by the hour and getting paid a salary, right? If you're paid for the hour, you're only paid for the hours that you work. If you're a salaried person, you basically get your same salary all the time. If you take a sick day or something like that, you still get your salary. But can they just work you a ton over 40 hours if you're a salary and say, well, you're a salary? The law says no, okay? If you have a salary, your salary has to meet a minimum amount to be qualified as a salary. So they can't say, well, your salary is $1,000. No, they have to meet minimum salary requirements, and they have to provide you with overtime. So if you work over 40 hours a week, they have to pay you for over those hours. Now, there are some exemptions to this, but generally that's the rule, okay? So there is an exemption for overtime if your salary is over $47,000 a year. So if your annual salary is $47,000 a year, they may not have to provide you with those overtime amounts. But if it's under, they do have to pay you for overtime. And vacation time may not qualify. So how does the Fair Labor Standards Act affect criminal justice? Well, just like in my example, if you have a crisis, if you have something big that's happening, right? You, in the criminal justice field, you have to take care of that. You can't say, well, no, my officers aren't going to respond because, you know, they're on overtime. We're just not going to do that. That doesn't work in criminal justice. So this Fair Labor Standards Act often becomes criminal justice administrators' worst nightmare because they may have to provide overtime and their budget's already set. So, but they have to do it. So where are they going to get the money out of the budget to pay for those additional salaries? Okay. So there have been some claims that criminal justice agencies should be exempt, that they should never have to pay overtime under the Fair Labor Standards Act. Not really happened. So it's an interesting topic. Should they or should they not? Now, you're a chief of public police, you're hiring 2 new entry-level patrol officers. Both will perform the same job. You narrow down your options to 2 individuals. One candidate is a male, the other is a female. You want to offer the male $50,000 for the position and only offer the female $40,000. You're trying to save a little money on the budget, and you think, well, the male has to support his family, and now the female has a husband that works, so we should be able to pay her a little less. Are you allowed to do that? Well, there is a federal law, that's the Equal Pay Act. This prohibits sex-based discrimination on wages and benefits. So you can, if they're doing the exact same job, they have to be paid the same amount. You can't choose to pay one more than the other. Now, a couple other criminal justice employee rights. You may have certain rights dealing with your workplace, and you may have certain constitutional protections. So let's talk about a couple of those. So, safe workplace. You have a right as an employee to work in a safe workplace, okay? Now, part of a safe workplace may be a workplace free from harassment, whether it be racial harassment, sexual harassment, religious harassment, national origin harassment. So any verbal or physical conduct based on race, color, religion, sex, whether or not it's a sexual nature, national origin, age, disability, sexual orientation, or retaliation. If you are being verbally attacked, things are said, physical contact because of one of these things, then that can create what's called a hostile work environment. If you can show that you are in a hostile work environment, you may be able to sue your employer for a violation of Title VII, okay? So not only do you have to experience some sort of harassment based on one of these characteristics, that harassment has led to a change in your employment status or benefits. So you didn't get a promotion, you got demoted, you weren't given the extra job, you didn't get a raise. So there has to be some adverse employment action because of that discrimination. What are some other things that could relate? Non-sexual contacts that are sexually motivated, illegal stops to get a look at someone. So you're a police officer and you think somebody's hot that drives by you, so you pull them over so you can look at them a little more. Voyeuristic contact, so watching people when you shouldn't be, sexual contact with crime victims, offenders, juvenile offenders, sexual shakedowns, demanding sexual services from prostitutes or other criminals in exchange for not arresting them, or citizen-initiated sexual contact. Somebody's hitting on you to get out of being arrested or a ticket and you participate. So these issues can come up in lots of different ways when you're talking about criminal justice employees. Now, Prison Intelligence Unit has knowledge of an impending riot, but fails to alert its officers who are subsequently injured. Can they do that? Can they be in trouble? So they know something's about to happen. They don't tell the officers, and the officers get really hurt because they don't take precautions. Or the police department knows their vehicles have defective brakes, but they don't tell officers because they don't think they'll take those cars. And then the brakes fail and the officer gets hurt. Can you sue your employer for that? Well, that can fall under what we call Section 1983. So it's not the year 1983, it's a section of the law. And this says you can sue your employer if they deprive you of certain constitutional rights, okay, civil rights, and your life would be a civil right. Most often these are used against criminal justice agencies because they're not protecting people's rights. And it could be a victim suing the police department because the officers denied that person their constitutional rights. Now, sometimes people sue because of what we call Osha. So Osha is Occupational Safety and Health Act. This requires employers to provide certain safety precautions for their employee. So one of them is training and supervision. If your job requires a certain level of training and supervision, your employer has to provide that. So there is no 1983 lawsuit unless you can show that your employer knew of the danger and deliberately ignored the danger, violating OSHA requirements, which violate people's constitutional rights, okay? So deliberate difference is knowing that it exists and closing your eyes and pretending like it's not. You cannot do that, okay? So a couple other constitutional rights: freedom of speech and association. Generally, people have the freedom of speech, and it's taking away your freedom of speech is really hard. They can only limit it in very, very small situations. The United States Supreme Court has said that there is a larger interest in regulating speech among your employees. And so they may be able to limit your speech in your job more than they could if you were just an average citizen, okay? So your employer can limit certain things that you say. So if you're getting on social media bashing your employer every day, you don't have free speech to say that. Your employer may be able to fire you because your speech is directly impacting their job, okay? Now, the restrictions can't be too broad, can't be too overwhelming, and they must be applied fairly. You can't apply them to some people and not other people. But we have what's called the Hatch Act, and that allows governmental employees to have their speech limited. That is your discussion for Chapter 2. So I've posted a bunch of materials and videos on the Hatch Act and how those restrictions in the Hatch Act affect criminal justice employees. Watch it, look at some of the materials, and participate in the Chapter 2 discussion. Now, what about freedom of expression? What about wearing certain religious symbols on their uniform or beards for religious purposes? Are employers allowed to restrict that? Can they make you wear a standard uniform? Can they make you not have a beard or certain things in your hair? These are issues that come up a lot, okay? And it's often a case-by-case determination on how much does that symbol or beard or hairstyle affect the qualifications for your job. If they're impacting the job in some way or the reputation of the organization, they may be able to restrict it. So you often have people raising these issues. Now, search and seizures. Police officers have same rights in their home, private home, as average citizens. You can't just go into somebody's home and search it without a warrant. But what about your work equipment and workspace? So my office at college, can they come in and search my office? Well, employees' offices within the business have less Fourth Amendment protections than somebody's private home. So in general, many situations, employers can go through people's workspaces and look at it. And you don't necessarily have a Fourth Amendment search and seizure. Same thing with a work phone. They give you a cell phone, but it's from your employer. Can they search what's on that? Probably, because it's provided by your employer. What about self-incrimination? This is one of those rights that's really different for police officers. If there is an investigation, there's an internal investigation, your department is conducting an investigation, and you refuse to waive your right to remain silent. So you say, I assert my Fifth Amendment right to remain silent, and I'm not going to talk to you. You can be fired for that as a police officer. So you don't necessarily have the same right against self-incrimination. We give you a lot of power, we give you a lot of discretion, so we're going to make you talk if there's an internal investigation. If you don't, you can be fired. Now, the one catch is they can make you talk, but if you say something, they can't use what you say against you for criminal charges. They'd have to use other evidence for those charges. So you have to talk, but what you say cannot be used against you. A couple other issues that often come up with criminal justice: sexual misconduct. So engaging in sexual misconduct with fellow employees, with victims, with things like that, that often comes up as an issue. Moonlighting. Can you work at other police departments on your time off, security jobs, things like that? Is that going to be permitted? And then issues dealing with misuse of firearms. Can you be fired for things like that? So those are other employment issues that need to be thought about with criminal justice. Another thing is drug testing. So we have Fourth Amendment against unreasonable searches and seizures. So one of the thoughts is, if they force you to undergo a drug test, is that a violation of your Fourth Amendment protections? Your body yourself is protected by the Fourth Amendment. So by requiring you to do a blood test, they're searching your body. So is that a violation of your Fourth Amendment, or do you give that up by becoming a police officer? Well, the courts have said that they can require blood tests for certain serious occupations like police and corrections and things like that. They can do it during the initial hire process, so before they even hire you, because it's not really affecting your job, you haven't gotten it yet, so we're going to allow that. And then certain positions that pose a risk to society. If I'm a sharpshooter, or I carry a weapon, or things like that, or I'm undercover drugs, they can test me for those, because me using drugs as a police officer could pose a risk to society. Okay, so those are reasons why they could drug test you. Another big issue with criminal justice is residency requirements. Some departments require you to live within their jurisdictional boundaries if they are going to hire you. So if you want to be a City of Batavia police officer, your house or where you live, your residence has to be within the jurisdictional limits of the City of Batavia. Some departments have this, some don't. People really weigh the pros and cons. So what would be some of the benefits of having this? You're close to work. If there's an emergency, you could respond. You're familiar with the area. You're heavily involved in the area. What could be a disadvantage? You may have trouble getting enough people to apply for the job within that geographic area. Another thing is, they're talking about New York City or something like that. It's very, very expensive to live in the city. If you had to live in the borough where you were from, it could be very expensive. The bureau where you work. So affordability could also be an issue. So you have to consider those things if you have residency requirements. And then another specific thing to police officers specifically have what's called the due process rights. Basically, what this says is that if there's going to be an internal investigation and you're the subject of an internal investigation that could lead to disciplinary actions against you, you have the right to written notification that you're being investigated. You have the right to have a lawyer represent you at the disciplinary hearings. And you have the right to ask for and have a polygraph examination conducted. So there are certain rights that you have as a police officer. Now, what are some remedies if some of these rights are violated? You could sue. You possibly can sue somebody for these violations. Torts is suing. So if they intentionally hurt you, that's called an intentional tort. If they were deliberately indifferent or negligent and you got hurt, that's negligence. Oftentimes, too, you may have contract claims. So you can sue people for violations of in your contract. You have a contract and they're not fulfilling your contract. What could you receive? You could get back pay. So if you're suspended up until the case is settled, you could get all your back pay. You may get damages, so that's money on top of what you would have got for your pay. You can get injunctive relief where they order the employer to stop doing certain things. And you might be able to get what we call punitive damages. So those are punishment. Those are money on top of it. And the reason why they're giving you that is to punish your employer for what they did. Okay? So to take all this knowledge and put it together, I have this learning check. So here's a little case study, okay? So if you read through it, you could answer some of the questions. What kind of employment laws or issues would be relevant? Is the officer disabled? Is the sergeant otherwise qualified for the position, even if they are disabled? What would you do? And summarize what you think. Okay, so there's, you can read through it and kind of look through your notes and it will spark some issues. So if you feel comfortable with that, then you can move on to do chapter 3 assignment. Okay, because it's going to be something similar. So that's all I have. I know it was a little bit longer. It's a lot of detail. So I highly recommend you print out that reference sheet. It will be very beneficial to you since it lists all of these things. So you don't have to remember everything. And you can use it on the exam and things like that. So if you have any questions, please reach out. We just have one more lecture after this to talk about some additional employee rights issues when you're talking about criminal justice. So thanks for listening, and I will see you soon.